Good morning, everybody. I see we're starting to get some participants in. We're going to get started at the top of the hour.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. I know people are going to continue to join, but I want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for part two of a three-part series aimed to keep you updated and informed about the priorities of the new Biden administration that are of importance to private forest landowners. I'm Scott Jones, CEO of Forest Landowners Association, and I'm joined today by FLA staff Melinda Gable, Vice President, Dr. Lauren Ward, General Counsel and Director of Regulatory Affairs, and Katie Moss, Policy and Legislative Assistant. We are very fortunate to be joined today by Brian Johnson, a partner with the Vogel Group in Washington, D.C., who consults with Forest Landowners Association on tax issues and legislative matters that we're working on for the association. We have a big group with us here today. We have registrants from private landowners from 26 different states and a couple of our international members. So good evening to all of you who are able to join us. So the procedure for today's call is you are all on mute for right now, but we do want to hear from you. So we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You can ask your questions two different ways. You can post your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can do that anytime, and we'll get to it at the end of the presentations. Or you can simply raise your hand at the end of the presentation by using the raise hand button, and Katie will unmute you, and you'll be able to ask your question live. Just a quick review of FLA's policy priorities. And these are the policy priorities that are built into our 6-month work plan that was approved by the board. It was built off of our strategic plan, and it's all built in a foundation of private property rights and economic success on your property. So the issues that we have identified here today are really what you're going to be hearing from and what progress we're making on that during the first 100 days of this administration. So of course, taxes, private property rights is really around regulatory issues, representation of family and private forest landowners, being the voice of private forest landowners. You're going to hear today how we're doing that, and also markets. Of course, without markets, we lack the financial incentive to continue managing these lands for future generations. So you're going to be hearing a little bit more about how we're trying to also communicate the value of markets to private forest landowners. So to get us started, Melinda Gable is here to talk to us a little bit about what we're doing with climate. Melinda?
Thank you, Scott, and hello, everyone. If you recall our last webinar, we focused on Biden's executive order dealing with his climate strategy and administration. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened since then in Congress. We're seeing a lot of hearings in the last 30 or so days, specifically focused on climate change and the role of agricultural and forest lands. And so, in fact, there's one happening today as we speak as well that is focused on the wood products and building components of that. So what we're seeing within these hearings is the various committees that have jurisdiction over climate and forestry issues, ag issues, having conversations about some of the initiatives that are being looked at in the administration or legislation that was introduced last Congress, and they're reintroducing it this Congress. It's been great conversation and exchange between the members of Congress and the witnesses. Most of the witnesses have come from the ag community because a lot of the focus they feel in some of the forestry carbon programs are more well known. So there's been dialogue there. FLA has tracked all of the statements being made by the members of Congress and witnesses that really relate to our issues and our concerns. We are building a resource library within our website, and we will share all of that information with you if you want to dive a little deeper, see what the members of Congress are saying, how the conversations are going. But right now, it's really just kind of an exchange of ideas. What we've seen, some of the comments back and forth is to make sure that whatever takes place in legislation dealing with forest producers, forest landowners, they use the word producers a lot instead of landowners because of what we're producing. So they want to make sure it's not a one size fits all, that the landowner is receiving fair incentive and monetary benefit from any programs. They're taking a look at private programs that currently exist, what type of cost share programs might exist, and just what a federal framework might look like for carbon. So those are the various areas and things we're tracking. As I said, we will have a resource library for you to be able to dig deeper. And if you want to see any of the witness testimony, any of the members. One other note is that we are seeing a lot more comments and attention on this issue from senators and members of Congress from across the country. So the geographical region, obviously, with what's happened out west last year, is moving beyond just timber in the Southeast timber belt, but it's a national issue with national interest from all members of Congress. On the legislative front, there's been a few pieces of legislation introduced. A lot of this legislation was introduced last Congress and now is being reintroduced. We are still at the beginning of the conversation. Two pieces of legislation that haven't been introduced, but we've been getting communications from. One looking to be introduced relatively soon is the Forest Incentive Programs Act, and the other one is the Trillion Trees Act. All three of the pieces you see here, the Replant Act, Trillion Trees, and Forest Incentives, all deal with planting and reforestation. The Replant Act is specifically dealing with federal reforestation and federal lands and what they're trying to achieve there, where the Trillion Trees Act, which was introduced last year by Westerman, is more in the private arena. FLA and the Forestry Association and stakeholders in DC have provided comments on these pieces of legislation. We are working with the staff and the members to make sure that awareness and representation from the private forest landowner, from the market perspective, is well known within the committees and the members of Congress. In addition to the hearings and what's going on in the Hill, we are also seeing movement in the private sector. So I just wanted to make note of that we're seeing the Securities and Exchange Commission. They've announced that it's going to set up a climate and environmentally social good task force. BlackRock, you may have seen this in the news if you follow, the different financial markets, but they are now really calling on governments to require mandatory climate risk reporting. So we're seeing action and interest both from the administration, Congress, and also the private sector. So we'll have more to report on that as actions take place. Internally with FLA and with our board and others who are really engaged, we've developed a carbon solutions team. We meet with them bi-weekly. They help review legislation, comments, Federal Register comments, and just ensure that the FLA staff, as well as the FLA board on behalf of our members, are really representing and having the right conversations within Washington, DC regarding your interests. So that's a quick snapshot on what's happened since the last time we had our webinar. And as always, if you have questions at the end of the webinar or after, please reach out and let us know. We're happy to provide more information. Lauren?
Thanks, Melinda. So I'll be giving an update today on a topic that's somewhat related to the climate initiatives, and it's called the 30 by 30 Conservation Initiative. So what is the 30 by 30? This is a goal to conserve 30% of America's lands and waters by the year 2030. So this idea has been around for a while, and it's been introduced in various forms of legislation in recent years, but it never really got any momentum going. But it was most recently included in President Biden's executive order on climate change. And so some actions have been taking place within the administration to figure out how exactly they're going to reach that really bold goal. The executive order on climate change says that the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Congress, along with the Council on Environmental Quality, which is under the White House itself, they all have to consult with stakeholder groups and develop a report that's going to be delivered to the Climate Task Force by the end of April. So all of these agencies right now are currently developing just really high-level principles or guidelines for determining whether lands and waters actually qualify for this label of conservation. And they're also supposed to propose some programs or models that seem to be working well that could help us move toward that 30% goal. After that high-level report is delivered, these agencies will begin that process of planning for programs and budgets to help implement those broad principles and broad ideas. We do expect that the 2023 Farm Bill will be a big part of that. And so overall, this process is going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight. And a lot of discussions are happening right now, and we've been an active part of those. From what we're hearing, the administration does envision the expansion of things like national monuments and other publicly managed lands, as well as even potentially conservation easements as important tools for reaching that 30 by 30 goal. However, we're also hearing that they do envision a role for private lands and working lands in particular, and working forests even more specifically. They do envision a role for them to play in reaching that 30% goal. So for example, it's possible that we might see a resurgence of the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, where landowners receive cost share dollars to plant trees. We're not sure exactly what it might look like. They're very much in the phase of developing these ideas. That's just one of the examples that we've heard. But FLA is actively engaging with the administration as they develop these plans to reach their goals. So FLA is obviously a very strong supporter of the protection of private property rights. We also believe that privately owned forests are responsibly managed for stewardship and sustainability. Many of our private forests probably offer a higher level of management and higher quality environmental benefits than some of our public lands, which could be poorly managed due to lack of resources, small budgets, or lack of even the political will to implement active management strategies. So locking up land in public ownership and expecting the result to be quality conservation outcomes, it's just not a realistic approach, and we hear a lot of voices coming to the administration with that message. Conservation requires management, as many of you and a lot of our trained natural resource managers know. So instead, FLA envisions a way for the administration to reach its goal by recognizing the stewardship and management that are already in place on millions of acres of privately owned working forests. We know that these working forests provide important environmental benefits, including carbon storage, but also water benefits and habitat for wildlife. These benefits need to be recognized by the administration. We've already had some productive conversations with both the Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the role that working forests can play in helping to reach that national goal of 30% of lands being conserved. So what's the message that we're bringing to these federal agencies on behalf of forest landowners? We're telling them that there is already stewardship and management taking place on the ground. We have a very strong tradition for privately owned and family owned forests in the United States, implementing stewardship and taking great pride in that stewardship and implementing active management on the ground. We also are stressing the importance of legacy. When family owned forests are successfully passed on to the next generation so that that next generation can continue that stewardship and management, then we're really achieving our conservation goals in the long term. And finally, we're shining a light on the importance of markets. Strong markets for wood and fiber products provide an active incentive for landowners to keep forests as forests and to continue managing their lands for all of the environmental and economic benefits that those working forests provide. So we'll continue to engage with the various branches of the federal government as this initiative moves forward. Overall, the more existing conservation already occurring on the ground that we can get recognized or counted as conservation, the less reason the government will have to condemn private lands and acquire new federal lands to reach their goal. And finally, I just want to make one more really important point. We actually see this as a really promising opportunity to have the administration help us carry the message that working forests have real benefits for conservation. Coming from a Biden administration, we feel that the message is that wood is good and that markets are key to conservation would be particularly impactful. And they're basically opening the door to do exactly that through this initiative. So we see a huge opportunity here, and we intend to pursue that. Moving forward, we'll continue these dialogues and keep our members posted as new developments emerge and some of the ways that they're implementing this become more specific. Thank you, and I will hand it over to Katie for her update.
Thanks, Lauren. So last week, FLA held a virtual forest forum with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Southeast Regional Team. So our forest forums are basically roundtable discussions that bring together diverse stakeholders that are all seeking solutions to issues that impact private forest landowners. These are usually held in tandem with our Timber Talks, which is where we get these stakeholders out in the woods to see private land management firsthand. And the purpose is to really bring landowners into the conversation, show stakeholders a different perspective, and get everyone involved in this conversation for the best outcomes. We haven't had these Timber Talks and forest forums in a while due to COVID. So this forest forum with the Fish and Wildlife Service was a really great opportunity for FLA staff and some of our board members to get involved and speak to the full Fish and Wildlife Service Southeast Regional Leadership Team. During this meeting, we gave an overview of who FLA is and discussed what private landowners can bring to the table when it comes to species conservation. And part of that discussion was also what landowners need from the service to make that happen. So that's things like privacy, transparency with the service, incentives, and assurances that their management won't be set back by any overreaching regulations. The tone of the meeting was really positive, really great conversation. The service was eager to learn more about FLA and figure out how they can help private forest landowners with what they're trying to do on their land. Some of the key takeaways from this meeting, the importance of keeping working forests working was a really key part of the conversation. Also, private land being very important for species conservation, especially on a landscape scale. As I mentioned before, we discussed the importance of having open lines of communication, transparency, and assurances for private landowners to be able to keep their working lands working. We also discussed future opportunities for Timber Talks and forest forums. Everybody on the services team was super excited for the opportunity to hopefully get out in the woods with our forest landowners and get involved whenever it's safe to meet face to face and whenever they have the ability to do so. And probably the most important takeaway from this meeting was that FLA is really establishing itself as a trusted resource for the private landowner perspective when it comes to the the Fish and Wildlife Service making these decisions and regulations that affect private forest landowners. So it was a really good opportunity to keep those lines of communication open and establish those relationships and set ourselves in the position to be a resource for them in the future. And with that, I will turn it over to Brian to talk about our tax issues.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you may be calling in from. My name is Brian Johnson with the Vogel Group. Thank you for having me again today to discuss some tax issues and legislative update focusing on taxes. As many of you know, Congress recently passed a very large COVID package that was focused on individuals, and now we feel that the focus will turn toward corporations, toward infrastructure, and toward energy items. The key that all of these have in common is that tax will be a very large component, both in terms of tax incentives for things like electric vehicle charging infrastructure and tax hikes to pay for some of these projects on the infrastructure spending side. However, with a large tax component, we are very hopeful that the casualty loss tax fix that we've been working on for some time will find legs this year, and we'll get to that in a second. As a reminder, please feel free to ask any questions during this or wait until the end. We'd love to have a dialogue with everyone. As many of you know, President Biden has pushed an agenda that calls for tax increases to pay for some of the spending that they want to enact. A list of a few of those is here, but ticking through it very quickly. Raising the corporate tax to 28%, reducing tax benefits for pass-through businesses. That's going to be repeal of the 199A deduction, which is the 20% QBI or qualified business income deduction. Reinstating the death tax at 45%, raising cap gains to the new higher individual top earner rate, which would be 39.6%. So raising that from the 20% that it's at right now. And this would be for people earning $1 million or more. So a little bit of a violation there. That obviously is going to trickle down and have negative impacts on the economy. We feel that of all of these tax increases, combining the top marginal rate increase and the corporate rate increase, that'll raise about $1 trillion. President Biden has indicated his infrastructure package is going to have a price tag of $2 trillion. So this gets you halfway there. The other half could be financed by deficit spending. But everyone's newest favorite popular senator now, Senator Joe Manchin, has said he can support a package of $4 trillion. So I'm not sure there's enough tax increases to pay for that, but I'm sure Congress can find some scary new ways to punish all of us to pay for infrastructure. Speaking of Joe Manchin, there's a few different ways these packages can come forward, and I do want to be mindful of our time. But very quickly, reconciliation is a word you've all probably heard recently. That's a process by which all 50 Democrats can unite to agree on legislation, and Vice President Kamala Harris can come down and be the 51st vote. There are certain rules in the Senate on what can pass under reconciliation rules, but they're definitely going to try to use that procedural motion to push some of this stuff through. The big question is, will they be able to get all 50 Democrat senators? Will Joe Manchin, will Sinema and Kelly from Arizona, will they vote on a partisan line bill to raise taxes? Taking reconciliation off the table, can the Democrats get 9 or 10 Republican senators to vote for tax hikes? Historically, Grover Norquist, the tax pledge, keeping rates low have all factored into this, but you now have a period where big corporations are not necessarily reciprocating any love for congressional Republicans, be it through cutting PAC contributions or pushing other agendas that don't align with the modern day Republican Party. Are they now going to step aside and let tax increases on corporations happen? All in all, the answer is no one really knows what this will look like. These are all of the pieces of the puzzle, and it's to be determined how they're going to put them together. But I'd say it's going to be very hard to pass all of these tax increases. I think the cap gains will be very negatively impactful on the economy. And time will tell how much political appetite folks have to raise corporate taxes or top earners tax rates. Very quickly, and I do want to be mindful of Q&A, we are working very hard to rebrand an effort around the casualty loss tax provisions. Forest Recovery Act is what the bill was last year. This year, it will be the Disaster Reforestation Act. Focusing on what Melinda discussed, are big congressional efforts on reforestation and how the forest and timber industry really align with the new climate and clean air agenda being pushed by Congress. And so we're very hopeful working with the new senators from Georgia working with Congresswoman Terry Sewell's office, who sits on Ways and Means, and other Democrats, that we can find a Democrat champion who is willing to either A, publicly reintroduce the bill as the Democrat lead, at which case we can very easily find a Republican co-lead, or two, bill introduction may not be needed, and they'll agree to quietly push this issue behind the scenes with leadership to make sure it gets put into any year-end package. With that, let me quickly wrap up so we can have time for Q&A, and happy to answer any more questions on any of these topics. And with that, I will turn it back over to Scott.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And for those of you who want to learn more about this, we will be, Vogel Group will be participating in our National Conference of Private Forest Landowners that's being held in Williamsburg, Virginia, June 16th through 18th. This will be a responsible conference. We will be socially distancing and trying to keep everybody safe, but we do think it's in the best interest of the association and private forest landowners that we do get together and meet. So Lord willing, everything goes well, we will be there, and we'd love to have you join us. This is how you can register for the conference. And like I said, the Vogel Group and others will be there to dig a little bit deeper into some of these issues and update you on where we are. We'll be infrastructure, like you just heard Brian said, will probably be up and running at this time. We'll have a lot more information about how we can engage as landowners in these conversations to protect your interest. I do not see any Q&As queued up here in the Q&A section, but Katie, do we have any hands raised?
Not at the moment, no. Oh, yes, we do. We have Jody Strickland.
Okay.
A question on the taxes. I was just wondering if there's been any discussion around the death tax, lowering the minimum exemption for that, or is it just talking about increasing the rates?
I have not heard anything about lowering the exemption. I've just heard reinstating at a 45% rate. As we move closer to infrastructure and as we start to see Congress putting together their version of the president's package, if you're talking about anything above 2 trillion as a way to raise money, they very well could lower the threshold that qualifies. So while I haven't heard that discussed right now, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if these are some of the dials that they try to turn to raise additional revenue.
Great. Thank you, Jody. And John, I hope that answered your question, but if it did not, we can come back to it. I want to get to this question on 30 by 30 that's being asked here is, Lauren, do we have any concerns that working for voluntary conservation on private lands as part of 30 by 30 will eventually turn into compulsory conservation practices? Good question.
That's a great question. And that's something that we're always keeping an eye on in various sectors of voluntary conservation practices, whether it's carbon proposals or wildlife. And so it's definitely something that we're keeping our eye on. And it's an important reason why we want to have a seat at the table for these conversations that are occurring right now. They, like I said during my update, they are looking at things like conservation easements and other innovative tools that they can use to sort of put some long-term voluntary conservation in place. And what we'll be advocating for is the most flexible conservation tools possible. We don't want landowners to have to get tied into long agreements, and we certainly don't want to set up a structure that could easily be translated into a compulsory or regulatory system. So it's something that's on our radar, and we'll definitely be keeping that in mind as we continue to engage in these conversations.
Katie, do we have any other questions? Any hands raised?
Yes, we do. We have Jake Graham. And then after Jake's question, we have Angela's question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, my question is about the EV tax credit that currently exists. Is there anything you think in the pipeline similar for forest carbon where we might could get a tax credit for generating carbon credits, or, maybe I'm behind and there already is a similar deal?
Scott, do you want to jump in
Yeah.
before me?
I'll jump in and ask Melinda knows about this as well, is that these are two items that we're talking about with some of the tax proposals, is not only transferable tax credits for landowners who are participating in carbon environment, but also transferable tax credits in the built environment that would incentivize the use of wood as a lower carbon building material in building commercial buildings. So those tax credits are part of what we would see as the solution or some of the drivers in a carbon program. But Melinda, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, you covered it, but that is one of the areas, where we see a proactive opportunity to really help engagement from forest landowners regards to economic viability, as well as increasing demand on the wood markets is to give that benefit to builders who build with wood, U.S. wood.
Great, Katie. We had another question?
Let's see, we had Angela, you lowered your hand. Do you still have a question?
And Angela, you'll need to unmute on your side as well.
No question here. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other
Alright.
questions? Any hands raised, Katie?
Let's see, no more hands raised at the moment. Let's see, I'm looking at our chat question about the conference that Amy went ahead and answered. We do have a question, current near future state of mills throughout the Southeast.
Yeah, great question. That we will more than likely be addressing in an upcoming issue of the magazine. I can tell you though that there is still a lot of capital investment occurring in some existing mills, and we're still seeing the interest in deployment of new capital into new locations to take advantage of course, what we all know in the Southeast is an abundant and fairly low cost resource for these mills. So we're still seeing the interest there and the capital investment happening both in existing and future mill sites. Katie, if we do not have any more hands raised, and I don't see anything else in the question Q&A box, I will thank everyone for their time this morning. I will encourage you to join us at the conference in Williamsburg to hear more about all this that we're discussing today. And also join us on the last part, the third part of the first 100 days of the Biden administration webinar series. We thank you all for your support and we wish you the best. We hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.